Sleepwalking deals with issues pertaining to depression, anxiety, acute phobias, and contains mild violence which may disturb some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Parts 1 through 8 of Sleepwalking were written between the events of accepting anxiety and fitting in, so please forgive any continuity errors. Roman!
Just before Virgil was able to reach Roman, his footing was lost, and he fell down the stairs which marked one end of the corridor. Anxiety was hardly aware that the noise, partnered with his yell, had more than likely roused Logan and Patton, nor did he care. In an attempt to check on his friend, he darted down the stairs 2 at a time, hoping he wasn't severely hurt. By the time he got to the base of the steps, Princey had managed to prop himself onto his arms in an attempt to get up, so Virgil extended a hand to help. He was shocked, however, when instead of accepting the gesture, Roman moved to strike him, and he just barely avoided the hand, which was clearly intended to claw him across the face. The prince looked up at Anxiety, the dim light casting an ominous shadow over his eyes, which glinted with fury. But he was more concerned with the blood, which now flowed freely from the cut beneath his friend's bangs. Once again, he moved forward to try to help amend the situation. But this time, Roman managed to land a blow, raking his remarkably sharp nails from the inner corner of Virgil's right eye, across the bridge of his nose, to the bottom left side of his jaw. Recoiling, he could feel the blood beginning to well up from his own new injuries, and barely heard the gasps, which echoed from the other two, who had apparently reached the top of the stairs. Still, his attention returned to Roman, whose voice was no more than a low growl, reverberating through the Mind Palace.
What the heck was that?
Anxiety was still reeling with shock from his friend's fall and the subsequent outward display of violence, to the point that he couldn't even feel the lacerations on his face anymore.
I was trying to help you.
He was stumbling to find the right words when the realization of what this whole situation must have looked like from Princey's perspective washed over him. Here, Virgil was standing just a few steps above him, and no matter what angle you looked at it from, it looked for all the world as if his friend's fall had been an intentional attack.
No, I didn't.
Help me? Why would you want to do that when you were the one who—
What happened?
Both of them looked up to see Patton, who had apparently regained his bearings, darting down the steps with Logan. Both of them were still in pajamas, and looked at the other two with varying expressions of confusion and horror. Roman was quick to answer, as his gaze shifted between the two new arrivals and him.
What happened? I'll tell you what happened. Mr. Bleak here pushed me down the stairs.
Virgil was at a loss. He knew the whole ordeal looked grim, and it seemed like anything he could come up with to say in his defense would seem like a questionable excuse at best. But he had to say something.
No, that's not what happened.
His breath was coming in quick, shallow gulps now.
I tried to stop you from falling.
Oh, really? That's interesting, because the last thing I remember is my head hitting the stairs on the way down, and when I looked up, you were the only one standing there.
Anxiety took a pace back, far more hurt by the accusation and the hatred that was reflected in his friend's gaze than any physical blow could ever conjure. Patton moved past him, and Virgil was ready to jump in his defense, but Princey showed no sign of aggression towards the paternal side.
Listen here, both of you. We can worry about who did what later, but for now, we need to make sure Roman's okay.
He faltered for a moment, as if unsure of what his next action should be, but he quickly regained his bearings, turning his attention to Logan.
Could you go get me some bandages and rubbing alcohol from the hall closet, please?
Logic merely nodded, before heading back up the stairs, clearly unwilling to defy morality now that he had entered his more parental state of mind.
Virgil, maybe you should wait in your room for the time being and try and get those scratches cleaned up.
It was clear that Patton wasn't trying to blame him, but simply keep him separated from Roman, who was still shooting him death glares. For a moment, Anxiety considered disobeying the request, but instead took a page from Logan's book and did as he was told, and with his head down, he made his way back towards his room. He was forced to pass logic as he walked, and he didn't miss the stern look he was given just before the door closed between them. As soon as he was alone, he picked up the notebook and pen, placing them gingerly on the desk before heading for the bathroom. Running some warm water into the sink, he used a small bit of soap and a wet cloth to clean the surprisingly deep gashes, which now ran diagonally across his face. Glancing up in the mirror, he guessed that one of the middle ones would end up scarring, even long after it had healed. Draining the water, he used a towel to gently pat the wounds dry, but as he did so, his eyes drifted back to his reflection, which stared at him with the same accusation as Roman had shown him. Had he not been so distracted by his ridiculous notes, if he had just been paying attention, he could have done his actual job and stopped all of this from happening. In the end, he knew even if the others believed he didn't push Princey down the stairs, anxiety was still to blame. Why hadn't he been able to stop Roman from falling? He'd had every opportunity to do so, and yet he had been so obsessed with these fears, which barely seemed to affect the others during the day, that he had failed to follow through on his primary job. Virgil was beginning to wonder why he had ever cared about these phobias in the first place. They didn't seem to pose that much of a threat. He paused, gazing at his own reflection. Or did they? It was the sleepwalking which had been the actual cause of the fall. What was to say it couldn't happen to the others? No, it wouldn't happen to the others. Next time, he wouldn't have his nose in some godforsaken book. Next time, he would be fast enough. Next time, he would do his job. Tearing his eyes away from the mirror, he left his bathroom and took the book and pen from the desk, placing them in the drawer of his bedside table. He would come back to them soon enough, but he had a feeling it wouldn't be long before Patton would come to talk with him, and now certainly wasn't the right time to bring up the book and its contents. Standing by the bed, he was left to wonder if he would ever bring up all the work he had done, or if the book and his research would remain hidden forever. A moment later, there was a knock at his door. Knowing that he couldn't avoid the situation forever, he moved to open it. As it swung open on its hinges, it revealed Morality, who had apparently retrieved his glasses, which now rested askew on the bridge of his nose. Meanwhile, he was still in his cat onesie, but the hood had been pushed back, and the mittens discarded.
Do you want to tell me what happened?
It was obvious that Patton had no time for jokes now. One of his sons was hurt, and he was facing the potential culprit. Anxiety took in a shaky breath.
Is Roman gonna be okay?
There was a momentary lapse in Morality's stern gaze.
He's going to be fine. He has a minor cut on his head and a sprained wrist. Now it's your turn.
His voice returned to its determined inflection.
What happened?
Virgil couldn't bear to look him in the eye.
I didn't push him, if that's what you're wondering. But Roman's right.
He paused, trying not to let his voice shake.
It's my fault.
As he trailed off, Patton spoke once more.
And why is that?
Anxiety couldn't bring himself to respond, so Patton spoke again, his voice more demanding this time.
Virgil Anxiety Sanders, you will answer me this instant. One of my sons is hurt, and he claims it was your doing. So I will ask you one last time. What happened?
He flinched at the use of his full name, closing his eyes in some desperate attempt to hide from the shame which burned at him like seething fire.
I was there.
He took in a deep breath.
I heard the footsteps in the hall, so I went to check who would be up so late. And when I walked out the door, I wasn't fast enough to catch him before he fell.
For the time being, Morality seemed genuinely confused.
So, how does that make the situation your fault?
I'm the fight or flight response. What purpose do I serve if I can't even do my job? If I can't keep you all safe?
A sense of panic was creeping up Virgil's spine as Patton stood before him in silence until he could bear it no longer. Anxiety glanced up, but kept his head down so as not to reveal the marks across his face.
That doesn't make this your fault.
Yes, it does!
He knew his breath was coming quicker, but he couldn't fight it, and his vision began to narrow.
It's the only redeeming quality I have, and if I can't even do that...
He trailed off, feeling the ground moving beneath his feet, and a moment later, his knees buckled. Next thing he knew, Morality had his hands wrapped around his arm, helping him to sit safely on the bed. He could still feel the shaking and lightheadedness which accompanied hyperventilation.
If I can't do that, then what good am I?
Virgil!
Patton sounded both shocked and hurt.
I don't want to hear any more of this. You are just as much a part of this family as Logan, Roman, or I. And you put forth far more than just being a fight or flight reflex.
He paused, allowing anxiety a chance to take in what had just been said.
Now, you need to calm down and talk to me. Roman claims he doesn't remember walking to the top of the stairs and thinks it's due to amnesia from when he hit his head on the floor. Can you give me an explanation for how he got to the stairs in the first place? And when he fell, if you didn't push him, did he trip in some way and he just doesn't remember?
Still slightly panicked, he looked to the floor. This was not how he had wanted to bring up the topic of the other's sleepwalking and nightmares.
I told you. I heard footsteps in the hallway. I went to investigate and
He shuddered.
I wasn't fast enough. He'll probably never forgive me for that.
Patton looked skeptical, and honestly, Virgil couldn't blame him. It was a feeble lie, at best.
Never say never. I'm going to go talk to Roman and see if I can calm him down. Then we can all sit down and discuss this in the morning.
Anxiety didn't respond with words. He simply nodded in agreement, as morality got to his feet and left the room. Now that the main crisis was over, and he had been left alone for the night, there was nothing to stop the thoughts which coursed through his mind. How could he have let this happen? It was his job, and his alone, to keep the others safe. Learning their fears had just been a way for him to try and get into their good graces, but it had backfired. He had been so focused on his little side project that he hadn't noticed the danger manifesting right under his nose. No matter what Patton said, Roman was now hurt, and it was entirely his fault. What made it worse was the idea that Princey would probably never trust him again, especially if he believed he had been pushed down the stairs. In a moment of sheer desperation, Virgil retrieved the book and pen from the drawer. Flipping to the empty pages, he began scribbling words down in handwriting that was nearly illegible. What he wrote undermined everything he had logged, researched, and documented over the previous weeks. When he had finished, a wave of fury crashed over him, and in blind rage he threw the items across the room as hard as he could. The pen bounced off the wall and landed in an unknown location, while the notebook hit the closest doorframe before fluttering violently to the floor, leaving the room in a deafening silence, save for his panicked breathing. Shaking, he curled up on his bed, drawing his knees close to his chest, and with no energy left to fight, he allowed himself to be consumed by the very same fears he embodied. Virgil had no idea how much time had passed when there was a knocking at his door, causing him to jump. A moment later, Patton's kind voice echoed from the hall.
Breakfast time!
He considered skipping the meal, not wanting to face the others, especially Roman, but it wasn't like he had much of a choice. The sides didn't spend a whole lot of time together, outside of filming, as their jobs often kept them separate, so Patton insisted they eat as a family. This was to try and overcome some boundaries, which still existed between them, and while it usually worked, something told anxiety that this was a meal in which nothing was going to be resolved. Taking his time, Virgil threw his black and purple hoodie around his shoulders, actually zipping it up and placing his headphones around his neck. He put on his signature black eyeshadow, but didn't risk putting on his pale foundation, for fear it would get into the scratches from the night before, and that they would become infected. Glancing in the mirror, he swiftly looked away. The 4 long marks across his face were just a reminder of what he had failed to do, and the consequences that had resulted from that failure. He knew he deserved the blow, and that the prince had fared far worse from his mistakes, so he didn't complain. Against his better judgment, anxiety made his way down the stairs to join the others, and from their voices, he could tell that he was the last to make an appearance. Before anyone saw him, he flipped up his hood, making sure it concealed the marks across his face. The other sides grew quiet as he took his seat, and they proceeded to eat their meal without their usual banter. Discreetly, he cast his gaze around the table, and he couldn't help but notice the concerned expression Patton wore, and the uncomfortable look in Logan's eyes as he ate his pancakes, which for some reason had Crofter's jam on them. Then there was Roman. His eyes, which still burned with anger, were trained firmly on Virgil, and something told him his quick scope of the others had not gone unnoticed. Time felt as if it were creeping by at the pace of a sleeping heartbeat. Each moment, sound, and tick of the clock was excruciating, and only morality was confident enough to speak, his voice loud, after such a long moment of silence.
Did everyone sleep okay last night?
Logic jumped at the opportunity to break the awkward tension.
I feel adequately rested. How about the two of you?
Anxiety didn't want to say anything. Even if he did, he would be lying, so why bother? He was saved from being asked again, as Roman's tone rose into the air.
Well, I for one hardly got any sleep with this sling on my arm.
He spat the word sling in Virgil's direction, but he wasn't going to rise to the bait. He deserved anything Princey wanted to say to him. Patton cleared his throat before addressing him directly.
What about you, Virg? Did you sleep okay?
Anxiety moved the eggs around his plate, but made no attempt to eat them, as he spoke in a voice dull and raspy from a night filled with panic.
Fine, I guess.
Well, that's good at least.
Roman's voice was a low growl as he cut Patton off.
Oh, great. I don't get my proper beauty sleep, but Captain Von Snap over here managed to get some rest.
Virgil could feel the fear rising in his throat, and he did his best to fight it down, but Princey kept going.
I really don't see how that's fair, considering he's the one who assaulted me last night.
Finally, the dam keeping Virgil's emotions in check broke, and in an instant, his fear turned to anger. Without lifting his head, he let his voice rise into the air.
I never touched you.
He hissed the words like a cat which had been backed into a corner.
You fell down the stairs. I tried to stop you, but I couldn't. I failed. Is that what you want to hear?
He forced tears away from his eyes.
I tried to help you, and then you assaulted me.
He threw his head back, letting his hood fall, and Roman gasped at the sight of the long gashes across his face.
If it makes you feel any better, I didn't sleep at all last night, just like every night.
As the words left Anxiety's lips, the walls seemed to close in on him, and his heart began to race. Quickly placing his hood back over his head, he shielded his face from the shocked eyes of the others. He nearly knocked his chair over as he pushed it back violently in an attempt to get away from the table. Then he darted for the common room, feeling as if there was no speed fast enough to get him out from under their watchful gazes.
Virgil!
Patton's voice rose up from behind him, almost pleading for him to return to the table, but there was no way he was going back after what had just transpired. When it became apparent that he wouldn't be rejoining them, Morality's tone shifted to a scolding one, which was clearly directed towards Roman.
For what I saw last night, Virgil didn't do anything to you. It was you who lashed out at him.
Unable to listen anymore, Anxiety placed his headphones over his ears, playing the loudest music he had on his phone before curling up on the sofa. Patton glared at Princey over the breakfast table, the remaining three sitting in a tense silence. Logan mostly kept his eyes trained on his pancakes, but would occasionally glance over to Virgil's uneaten meal. Roman finally dared to meet his gaze, and his fierce look turned to fear as Morality spoke, his voice having fully taken on the tone of an angry father.
You listen to me, young man. Virgil was brave to even join us for breakfast this morning, because I would be willing to bet he knew something like this was going to happen. Even still, he came anyway, and what you've just done was way out of line. Next time you see Virgil, you owe him an apology. Do you understand me?
He pushed me down the stairs.
Roman sounded defiant, and yet he shrunk away at Patton's glare. He couldn't believe what he was hearing.
Until I know exactly what happened, I don't want to hear any more accusations, because I'll tell you something I probably shouldn't. Virgil told me last night that he didn't push you, and I will admit that I had my doubts initially, but I'm starting to believe he's telling the truth. Do you know why that is?
The prince shook his head, but wisely remained quiet.
Even though he told me he didn't push you, he still thought the whole situation was his fault because he wasn't fast enough to catch you. Now he has taken the blame in an attempt to make sure you don't hate him, so next time you see him, you will give him a sincere apology. Not just for what you've said this morning, but also for lashing out at him last night. Do I make myself clear?
Roman simply nodded before returning his eyes to his plate. Patton knew he sounded nothing like himself, but he was both angry with and disappointed in Roman, and the lack of sleep from the nightmares he had been plagued with wasn't helping either. He had tried to shake off the thoughts, occasionally dismissing them as nothing more than bad dreams, but they had become more frequent and vivid as the nights passed, He had intended to ask Virgil about them for days, but he just never seemed to be able to find the right time to bring it up. That was not to mention that he believed his fears to be ridiculous ones, and honestly, he really should be able to get over them on his own. Pushing the thoughts away, he glanced over to the commons to see Virgil curled up on the couch with his headphones on. Knowing that he was going to be all right for the time being, Patton picked up his plate and headed into the kitchen. Turning on the tap, he began to do the dishes. When he had finished, he joined the others in the common room, where each was focused on their own activities, but it was Virgil who caught his attention. He looked as if he were asleep, an extremely uncommon occurrence to say the least, but Patton was just glad he was finally getting some well-deserved rest. His eyes drifted over to Roman, who dared not look away from the television as he watched America's Got Talent. Logan, on the other hand, appeared far more comfortable than he had during breakfast, sitting on the sofa adjacent to Virgil's, reading a book called The Disappearing Spoon. Quietly, so as not to disturb the others, Morality sat down next to Logic, and watched the television as a young girl won the golden buzzer. About half an hour had passed when Virgil stood suddenly, making his way towards the stairs, without so much as a word to the others. Patton thought he might have woken up, and decided to go back to his room to sleep, but something about him seemed off, so he spoke up gently.
Where are you going, Virg?
There was no reply, but Morality didn't need Virgil's perceptive senses to notice the way he stumbled up the stairs, as if he didn't know where they were.
Virgil, are you okay?
Again, there was no response from him, but Logan, who had looked up from his book, answered with the slightest hint of confusion to his voice.
I think he's sleepwalking.